QSO Today, episode 527, Ron Demcko WA2TBQ. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. From some of the messages that I received after the last podcast, my absence for about 6 months was not fully explained. I suffered a bout of cancer last November that caused some severe changes to my body. While the cancer seems to be under control, the side effect was osteoporosis that caused my spine to collapse, making me about a foot shorter than last year. My breathing is quite impaired, so catching my breath is now quite deliberate. I have oxygen concentrators throughout my house to help when necessary, fortunately now occasionally. Most of my recovery efforts are to build myself back up to live with my new stature. My days include physical therapy, Nordic walking on poles, in addition to working for a living, building projects in my shop and QSO Today. To this end, I have lots of ideas for my QSO Today audience, but have to implement them more slowly than before. QSO Today interviews are scheduled and ongoing, but my ability to post weekly is not. So my goal is to post a new episode every 2 to 3 weeks until I am back on top of my game. So I appreciate all of you who continue to support the QSO Today podcast with your sponsorships and donations, especially during the time that I was away. If you are new to the QSO Today podcast, please be sure to look at the QSOtoday.com website, where we have over 500 interviews with amateur radio operators. From there, you can click on links that will take you to the QSO Today Academy. Our catalog contains over 500 videos on every ham radio subject, completely searchable. My plan for the summer is to start posting all of the QSO Today Academy videos on YouTube. Ron Demcko WA2TBQ found his way into electronics and later amateur radio thanks to the early influence of his older brother John, KD7JR. From a young age, Ron funded his growing passion for kit building and radio experimentation by buying and reselling surplus electronic gear, a resourceful start that helped pave the way to his formal education. Today, Ron is a recognized expert in the field of radiation-resistant passive components, essential for military and space applications. On the air, CW remains his favorite mode. We cover all of this and much more in this QSO Today. WA2TBQ, this is Eric 4Z1UG. Are you there, Ron?
Hi, Eric 4Z1UG, WA2TBQ. It's great to catch up.
Ron, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, quite a long time ago. I was a young child. I've got a older brother who is KD7JR. And, before there was Google, I had the luck of having a brother that was very much into radio, going into engineering school, and he helped me out quite a bit. So pretty much at age 10 or so, I started getting involved in electronics to one extent or the other. And at about age 13, I got my license. I was WN2TBQ in upstate New York. And at the time, he was WB2SHE, going to engineering school, and helped me out greatly. So I'm super lucky to have an older brother that really guided me throughout all of this.
What was the hometown there in upstate New York?
Well, Richfield Springs, so it's a little place. Probably the closest larger city would be Utica. And actually in Utica, there was a surplus facility. There was an old GE microwave facility there, and I managed to spend some time grabbing things at 5 or 10 cents a pound. So it was really awesome. A lot of fun, right? Myself and a couple other kids from the community, we'd load into one of the guys' father's station wagons and come back with all sorts of stuff.
You were surplusing on the weekends.
Oh, yeah. In fact, that helped me out through college quite a bit. I surplused. We would go to a lot of Hamfest. We would go to, the Central New York Hamfest. Once I went to the one on Long Island, and the big one was Dayton. So my brother and I went to Dayton probably about 1970. No, it would have been about 1981. No, 1978. Take it back, right? So in 78, we made enough money for myself to get a really neat Yaesu FT101E that just kind of progressed into other radios through the time.
So your brother is the guy who inspires you into amateur radio and into electronics in general. But you had from age 10 until age 13, what kind of things were you doing electronic-wise in those days?
Well, Heathkits and surplus, it was really neat. There was, at that surplus site, I would be able to grab some cheap things like cheap scopes or some of the emergency flashing light beacons, and I just thought those were the neatest things. So I'd do a little bit of playing there, but a lot of it was Heathkits, and I really loved building Heathkits. Managed to do everything from some of the small transceivers like an HW7 to depth finders and some of their equipment and pretty much a good spectrum of their kits. I really miss them. It was a great hobby.
What was your source of income that you were able to buy all the Heathkits and the surplus stuff?
Yeah, well, I was a paper boy, but the surplus business actually was really good. In fact, I had an interesting situation a couple of times. I would skip school, knowing my parents would know and all that, because I'd have a truck coming in where people would be, coming to pick up equipment. So I had one actually coming in from Ohio, and I had to take the day off and all that. And the interesting thing was the day beforehand, I guess word got out that I was going to be doing something other than school. So the principal parked across the street, and he saw us loading up the truck and this and that. So then, little kid, I'm walking down to the bank with, I don't know, a fair amount of money. And the principal comes in and sees me depositing the money and all of that. And he mentioned I wasn't at school. And, I kind of showed him the deposit slip and said I couldn't afford to miss out on this shipment today. And he walked out, I walked out, I didn't get in trouble. So that was a good.
You actually spent a lot of time getting surplus gear. You brought it home. Did you repair it? You had a business running, it sounds to me. Talk a little bit about that business that an 11-year-old is running. He's not letting school get in the way of his education.
Yeah, that's right. It was true. Well, it was fun too, right? So we'd grab oscilloscopes or keyboards. Usually a keyboard at the time would be broken up. I'd get it for maybe $1. And those could be spun for something well in excess of that, probably more like 50 or 75. It's good money.
What kind of keyboard are you talking about now?
Well, those are just like data entry keyboards from companies like Mohawk Data Sciences and Univac at the time. They were both local. So these would be scrap devices that were being thrown out. And then the equipment, that was mainly older vintage, like the 743 Tektronix stuff, the big ones. And as a kid, it was hard to lug those things upstairs, right? They're probably 50 pounds. And eventually I got good at moving them around, right? So in some cases, it would be as simple as just, dusting them off and getting the dirt off of them. And usually you'd spend those for $300 or $400. And you'd buy them for maybe $50. So, this was a great source of income, helped me out throughout college. And like I said, it was something that we kept going until, probably the junior year of college to some extent or the other. But, during high school and such, that was a very big portion of time.
You had a surplus business and your brother was your partner?
Yes, right. I couldn't drive. So very luckily, he would, and of course I didn't really know what I was doing. So he'd be telling me, okay, there's a bad tube there, this and that. Right. And that kind of how it all, it started out there. So, I went from the Heathkits and then started thinking, well, I really want a way to buy more Heathkits and the like. And one thing led to the other. Along the way, though, there were some really neat things, right? Because I learned about magnetic core memory where they'd actually be stringing cores. And, a lot of guys never had that going into engineering school. So I think I was really blessed with some practical experience prior to going to college.
as a young teen, you must have had quite a test bench as well, right? Because you were repairing.
Well, it was pretty easy. We'd have a couple of good scopes that we could rely on. I guess they were old at the time, so I tended to have two, at one point in time, and then a couple of great ohm meters, and pretty much that was it. Now, when I got into trouble, we'd take it to my friend's house. Lee Marshall, his father, was actually a commercial repairman, and then we'd do some further things up there. I remember the first time he showed me how to cool electronic components with some of the canned coolant. And oh boy, that was like magic, right? So there was a lot of experience through just, I guess, finding all the different spectrum of problems you might have in a scope. Or I think I had one network analyzer that was that was really beyond me at the time. But
what choices did you make in high school that led you to where you are now? It sounds to me like the schools gave you a wide latitude to be able to choose what you did with your time and what your interests were.
Yeah, I think it was more the case that if you still could pass the test and not cause problems, you could do pretty much whatever you want, right? So there was, of course, some great teachers there. I liked math quite a bit at the time. The science stuff was good, but I really had more interest in electronics. So that pretty much was the basis of it. When I got to college, I really didn't know which way to take it. My brother went for power systems. That really wasn't me. Anything over 110 volts, I'm probably worried with, right? And semiconductors were just really getting out of their infancy back in, the early 80s. And that I had the luxury of having a professor, Dr. Dominguez, who talked about that semiconductors are only part of the story. And his thought was that passive components were going to have quite a bit of progress that needed to be made. Through him, I actually worked on a internship in college, which tested components, passive components, under very high transient fields. So that further got me interested in actual physical components, the passives, primarily capacitors, but in some cases, some inductors and resistors. And then throughout college, that was one of the themes, right? We were looking at how the actives would need very efficient supporting passive parts. And then I managed to get an internship at a company in the South, Corning Electronics. And then it just kind of blossomed from there. Corning Electronics made only passive components. And at the time, it was really a good fit.
Where did you go to college?
Yeah, Clarkson College of Technology. They've since changed the name to Clarkson University. So you could tell I went to there in the early days before it became a university. But it was a 4-year degree, engineering. And it was a great place. It really was. It was quite cold. It was very close to the Canadian border. And the opportunity to go to North Carolina on an internship really was appealing. At that time, I played a lot of golf. And in fact, in the first few years of working, normally you would think that life would only be work, but I managed to play golf before work, after work, and on the weekends. So it was a really good deal. Yeah.
What was your first rig as a novice? Did you have a novice rig, or did you have something that your brother and you adapted for your novice service?
Well, he set me up really well. We had HW101, and that was a wonderful radio. Managed to spend an incredible amount of time on CW. And then eventually we upgraded that to an FT101E and still kept on CW. So pretty much from about 73 to 81, I was very active and exclusively CW, and they had a blast. Then, during the latter part of college, it was tough. So I didn't spend that much time on the air. But then, after being down in the Carolinas for a while, I managed to get more radioactive, I guess. And now we've got some great time logged on the air.
I'm looking over your shoulder and I see a Drake TR4.
Yeah.
So you've got some vintage gear behind you. What is the rig now? I mean, besides the Drakes, you're restoring that equipment and then you use them on the air?
Yeah, mainly straight key night. So I like to do straight key night. I'd like to really put in a plug for that. It's a wonderful event. If people could fit it in on New Year's Eve, I guess, or New Year's Day. But yes, I'll use the Drakes or the FT101Es for straight key night. Luckily enough, I got a pair of the TR4s. And then I've got a TR7 Drake, a couple of FT101Es, HW99, and some of the QRP rigs from Heathkit. My main rigs now are at IC 7300 and Yaesu FT DX 1200 and an FT 950.
I recently sold my IC 7300 to a friend of mine, and I think it's one of the worst decisions I've ever made. I want it back. For the money, it's quite a user experience.
It really is. I mean, I really still love the old rigs, and I would imagine that I hope to have them, always around. In fact, WA2RQC Otto has been very kind in helping me find these radios, and some of them needed a lot of TLC, some of them, just some light dusting. But I can't imagine life without that IC 7300. I picked one up at Dayton this year, and it's just absolutely outstanding.
For the price and the value, it seems like I can hardly operate a radio without having a spectral display.
Yeah.
You're still a CW operator?
Yes, I am. I'm getting back up to speed now. In the early days, I've managed to get up to maybe 30, 35 words per minute very easily. And now I'm well over 25, but 30 isn't as easy as it used to be, I suppose. Maybe it's age or whatever, but I'm building it back up, so we're having fun.
Do you have a favorite keyer or key that you like to use?
Well, yeah, I still like the benchers. I mean, they're just a great old, it's a great keyer. I was actually given a Vibraplex bug, and I tried to operate the RSGB. I think they have a bug night, right? Oh, that was a disaster. I just can't use a bug. And my straight key, in fact, I just gave my brother, his grandson is looking to get into CW. So I gave him the original straight key, or the two straight keys that my brother gave me back in, maybe about 70, about maybe 1968 or 70. So we're recycling some of the equipment for the two generations on, right?
You have a test bench now. I think you sent me a picture. It was very nicely arranged, so it didn't look like you were working on it when you took the picture of the bench. But do you have any unusual test equipment on your bench, or what do you think is probably the most valuable piece of test equipment that you have?
Well, I have a TDS 784, so that's a great scope, and it's wonderful. I bought that surplus for $300 or $400, and that's probably the big deal to all of it. And right, I'm kind of at the point of being in between houses here and potentially moving from this one to another one. So I've got some projects that are kind of abandoned on there on the test bench. The difficulty is the new place, the whole of the test room is actually only about 8 by 8. And right now I'm lucky enough to have a 12 by 22 heated and cooled garage bay with it's separate and walled off and all of that. Great lighting. So I've really got some stuff to catch up with. One of the other pictures I may have sent is from my friend's shop. Ben has a 3D milling equipment. He's got 3D printers and even a home pick and place machine where we can go on down to 0402's case size, 0402 case size, and it's quite a bit of fun. So I have to say I managed to get up there a fair amount and have some great fun with him on projects. So it's lucky. I don't have the room anymore, especially in the new place, for all of the good toys.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project now has over 500 podcast episodes and hundreds of hours of virtual ham radio expo presentations, all freely available and fully supported by you, the listener. This short message and the later mention of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast are the only breaks in the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors, so no one influences the content or direction. This project exists solely to promote amateur radio and the people who make it thrive. Producing QSO Today is like a half-time job. Your support at any level covers the tools, hosting, and production costs that keep it going. And while it is a labor of love, it isn't free. Only about 6% of listeners contribute. Please consider making a donation. Use the slider on our donations page to set up the amount that reflects the value that you get from each episode or from our library of educational videos. Make it monthly to help secure the next 500 episodes. You can also become a listener sponsor, shop on Amazon using our referral link, share QSO Today with friends, subscribe to our mailing list and YouTube channel, and help spread the word. Every action is value for value. Keep QSO Today alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO. Now you're wearing a Coursera AVX shirt.
Yeah.
After Corning, you spent quite a number of years at AVX, I understand.
Yes.
And you spoke a little bit about Dr. Dominguez and his interest that maybe spurred your interest in passive components. Can you talk a little bit about passive components? And it seems to me that you're the expert on radiation-hardened passive components. Could you talk a little bit about how critical and crucial that is to some of the industries that the West finds themselves in and your contributions to that?
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, there is a fair amount of magic almost occurring in the world of flight electronics, mainly the CubeSat, the LeoSat, GEOs, and things like that. So I've been lucky enough to work with Danya, who is K06DZY. Danya works at JPL. And through that, I get to view the needs for components through a much younger engineer's eyes. And the world of active devices are really quite broad. I mean, there's quite a few radiation resistant, radiation hardened pieces of active devices that are out there, from TI, and et cetera, right? The whole spectrum. And what is being discussed and what's being looked into is how can passive devices, which are, I guess, to some extent inherently susceptible to radiation, how could those be used in some of these low Earth orbit weather type satellites, et cetera, and not be, torn apart. So that's interesting. I get the chance to work with Aerospace Corp on a variety of committees and meetings. What you could generally say is things can become much more radiation resistant by using certain grades of dielectrics, which are stable. They're stable actually in transient fields as well. So if they get hit with a relatively large incoming voltage, they're stable. And in the presence of radiation, they're also stable. Commonly, you would find the components would degrade, turning somewhat into resistors. So now you have a capacitor with an exceptionally high leakage current or a very high or very low resistance. So there's ways around that. And of course, capacitors are really critical to those active devices on the satellite platform, where they might have more interest in doing processing of data on the actual satellite than downlinking things. The amount of data that you get out of these flight platforms is just amazing. So quite a bit's changed. You can't fly with a variety of 0.1 microfarad capacitors at the end of each IC anymore. It's quite a bit different than that. In fact, that kind of leads me into an interesting story about supercapacitors in space. You're just starting to see.
You have to define the terms then for people like me that need it broken down a little bit more. It just occurred to me, and frankly, I'd never thought about radiation hardened until I was researching this episode. It sounds to me like if you've got a capacitor, for example, what you're looking at is whatever the dielectric is made of or whatever the components are made of in terms of whether they're resistant to radiation.
Yes.
It's not like you're building a cage around these components. You're actually choosing the elements that go into it that are not susceptible to being broken down by radiation.
That's exactly it, right? You're choosing the material systems that have a resistance to radiation, and then there's a way that you could design those material systems in such a way to further minimize the impact of radiation upon them. In the semiconductor world, well, they do some other interesting tricks. But for us, it's specifically the material systems and ways to put them together, whether it's with dopants or certain thicker dielectrics, which make the parts have less leakage and things along that line. But, that's a really good example of how a passive device absolutely impacts and limits the performance of an active device in a whole active system. And of course, now that concept is being taken to the world of AI and quantum computing and such. But yeah, radiation resistance. In fact, that's what my college intern work was somewhat concentrating on. In that particular case, it was transient fields and some other things that were occurring. It's funny how it all ties together, isn't it?
Would we want to consider radiation-hardened components for amateur radio builds now, given maybe the price differences may be minimal? The danger to our project is buying counterfeit or bad components from a dealer that we think is okay. Do you see some crossover from your commercial experience on the radiation-hardened side to applying it to amateur radio projects?
Well, I'm lucky enough. I met some of the satellite team up in Dayton, and hopefully we'll be giving them some donations of very high-end componentry, whether it be clock oscillators or capacitors, or resistors, even that. But I think for the type of work that most of us do in our radio career, I definitely wouldn't go with the cheapest of passive parts, and I wouldn't really go with the radiation-resistant ones. Although they're great, radiation-resistant parts are super. But one of the problems is they typically have a much smaller capacitance value, and although they're exceptionally reliable, they would not have anywhere near the amount of capacitance that you might need in some of our circuits without maybe putting 10 of them in parallel. So luckily, I have to admit, I get a great deal on components working here. So much of my project work is done with auto-grade parts, and the automobile-grade parts are very minimally more expensive than consumer-grade parts. And although consumer-grade parts meet their specifications, the automobile parts have an incredible consistency from lot to lot and part to part, where I have no concern about how things might change across time. So, for instance, my friend that I mentioned earlier was building a few displays for, in fact, older test equipment. The displays was going out, and he came up with an option for doing something else. In that particular case, where you're building multiple units, auto-grade parts are really tremendous. In fact, the rule is that we cannot change the materials or even the design without written acceptance from the end customer. So you'll find those parts are very consistent, and if you make 100 or 200 million a day, you get really good at it. And that, believe it or not, is not an excessive volume for companies building passive parts now.
For example, I think I bought an assortment of 1,000 resistors for, I don't know, $15. You can't even read the colors on the quarter-watt resistors anymore. Although I guess people aren't using a lot of quarter-watt resistors, I still use a few. Are you saying that if I went to DigiKey or Arrow or someone like that, I would ask for an auto-grade part, and then I'm getting something that it's not radiation hardened, but it's also within its tolerance because it has to be?
Right. Yes. I think that's correct. You could go to any of those catalog distributors or the main distributors and look for AEC Q200, which is the automobile spec, and you'd find that those parts would exceed their data sheet by a very great percentage, and that data sheet would be quite detailed. So I don't mean to say that the consumer grade parts aren't bad. They certainly are good. However, let's look at it this way. If we're building maybe a switching power supply, right? And if we use a consumer grade part, there is a possibility that the equivalent series resistance or even the resonant frequency of that part could change. So although the part still meets the specification of capacitance, dissipation factor, tolerance, voltage rating, insulation resistance, right? The other parameters, which are quite important to a switcher's design, those other parameters could change. So for that reason, I don't use consumer grade parts, but they're certainly able to be used in a variety of applications pretty successfully. So I guess I have a little bit of an advantage in having a great source of parts, a cheap source of parts, but also I guess I want that consistency.
You alluded to a story in a message that you sent to me about getting a car. Was it a Miata?
Yes, it was.
Could you tell that story about how you obtained a Miata that got waterlogged and what you did to get it running?
Sure. Well, I had an MGB. So the start of the story is that I always loved MGBs and still do. I had a 75 MG. I got it for $1,250. And like any MGB, I needed some parts. So I'm off at the junkyard looking for MGB parts. And it turns out a gentleman that I had golfed with, I had never known that he owned the junkyard. I had always been buying him Cokes and because he'd always beat me at golf, right? So I'd buy him Coke and popcorn and all that during our outings. And I was saying, hey, I need MG parts. And he said, well, why don't you buy this brand new MG? It's just been flooded and come on to my house. So he had a flatbed come to his house, which was at the back end of the junkyard. He was thinking of keeping it for himself. And he said, I'll give this thing to you. And I got a great price on it. I had like 31 miles or so on it. And it was a fast rising flood at the dealership. The Miatas were so light, this little thing got picked up by the water and put in a ditch. The water came up to the floorboards inside the car, and actually the ECU.
The ECU is what?
Engine control unit, right? Yeah, so the engine control unit. So the main computer for the car, right? And so it wouldn't start. He gave me a great price on it. Basically, looking at the ECU, it just needed to be dried out. However, in drying it out, there was noticeable damage. The electrolytics had popped off of the board, and the aluminum electrolytics, they were radials at the time. They had water that got inside the seal, and there was electromigration, some other things that had occurred, and basically they were shorts. So, I took the ECU out, having a great access to our lab at the company I worked at. I did the ultrasonic cleaning where I could, baked things out where I could, and used some localized heating and cleaning equipment on certain parts of the board. So I took all of the capacitors off, which are typically the problem with a lot of things, and threw in tantalums because I knew the tantalum parts were more reliable, and in the particular configurations, they weren't seeing high ripple currents or anything. And put the ECU back, and all of a sudden drove the car for many, many, many years. It was a great pleasure. And I just loved the fact that in fact, during the thing, I liked the Miata so much, I sold the MGB, and I kind of kicked myself for that. But, I don't need a 50-year-old MGB at this point in life. But yeah, it was great application of kind of like ham radio rebuilding stuff again, and having access to good parts in a good lab.
Always a nice combination.
Yeah.
I had a business for a while where I was fixing head-end gear for cable television companies. What I discovered was the first thing to do is just replace all of the electrolytic capacitors and whatever was sent to me, whether it was a modulator or something like that. And then when I was all done, I replaced all the caps and everything was working. There wasn't a lot of troubleshooting to be done because usually that stuff runs so hot. It was computer data centers that told everybody that everything should be cooled down, but a lot of these cable television head ends were over 100 degrees most of the time. So I discovered that by replacing all of the electrolytic caps at the very beginning, I could save the troubleshooting time, and usually the thing worked just fine as soon as I was done.
Yes.
That was an interesting discovery, and I think that you also, in your message to me, that you also alluded to the fact that caps usually are the problem with older gear, and maybe that's a good first step.
Yes, it sure is. I just got the power supply for HW101, and same thing, right? The old electrolytics were all basically bad. They dried out. So normally you would think that the electrolyte would be safe with the containment methods. Typically, it's just a rubber seal with crimped aluminum. So, in fact, what I'll do there is, here again, I'm lucky that I work for a company that builds them, but I will upgrade the wet electrolytic to a polymer electrolytic. And those have a much higher reliability. It's not going to have the same dry out considerations, lower ESR, they run cooler, things like that, right? So that's kind of my go-to now. I don't necessarily go to tantalums because because mainly tantalums are surface mount. And when I need a replacement for an older electrolytic, maybe one on a video game or my Heathkit power supply, well, then I'll use my leaded parts that are polymers in nature.
That also leads me to a question. I bought a kit on eBay for recapping my TS520.
Neat.
So now you got me thinking that perhaps the guy that is selling the capacitor kits is buying from the guy I would buy them from in China. I guess I should go look through the bag and see whether or not they're actually seconds. And he's just got a great margin on the caps. Do you find that there are, say, military space grade techniques that you use at work that you've now applied also to your ham radio builds and stuff?
Absolutely. That's a really interesting question, and that's absolutely true. Maybe the easiest, I do a lot of surface mount work in stuff at home or rebuilds and along that lines. But if you look at what the main cause of a failure in a ceramic capacitor is, usually it's not an inherent error that the manufacturer had made. Usually it's an application error. And of those application errors, the vast majority are physically induced. So the biggest physical problem with the capacitor is really board flexure, where the capacitor, really it's a ceramic brick, and it's connected by terminals on the end of it to something that it could flex. And that flex could put a strain on the termination. It could cause a crack, a micro crack, that over time would pick up moisture, and it would turn that capacitor into a resistor, whether it's 100K or 10K, or with time it's going to happen, right? So what we've done, or what I'll use, is if I'm using a standard part, I put two capacitors in series and I orientate the pads opposite to one another, 90 degrees opposite. So if there's flex, so imagine an L shape, right? Each capacitor would be placed in that L along the portions of the L, put in series, and you'll find that if you flex in one direction, okay, fine, the cap might become a short, but it's not a dead short to ground because there's another capacitor with it. So that's the easiest surface mount trick. Now, there's another way you could go about that. Incidentally, if you're driving, I won't say what car, but if you're driving a car, this is actually a very major problem for everyone on something called Terminal 30, which is power at all times. And they will get around this problem by either putting two standard capacitors at 90 degree orientation to one another, or they may use a single capacitor that has two individual capacitor electrode stacks inside of it. So in fact, although it's a single case size, there are two different capacitors in series. And then on the termination, there's a conductive epoxy that's overplated with the termination that you would solder to. That conductive epoxy takes up the board flexure strain as well as a coefficient of thermal expansion mismatches, and you would eliminate probably 999 million, 999.9 thousand out of a million type problem. So you'd end up with 1 in a million problem. It's a wonderful way to fix that problem. Another trick, which is kind of neat, if you're using a radial capacitor, sometimes the cleaning methods that might be used in that capacitor would still allow impurities on board. And those impurities might break down under certain conditions, depending upon what they are, into hydrogen that might propagate its way up the lead if the part was placed vertically on the board, like a normal electrolytic would be. The way around that is to bend the leads, lay the electrolytic on its side on the board, and then the hydrogen would come on up the leads, but it's not going to take a right turn and go into the capacitor and change the partial pressure inside and then blow the thing out, right? So that's another good trick. Very simple physical type tricks. And then there's derating. So in some cases, heat is always the problem, right? Heat and electric field strength intensities always the problem within any part. So there's ways that you could choose larger case size parts and higher voltage parts, derate them, and you could easily get a 10,000 or 100,000 improvement in the reliability of that part in application of using commercial parts.
With part shortages and counterfeits in the marketplace, if you weren't at AVX, how would you advise other hams to source their parts?
Right. This is difficult. I guess my first thought would be to buy from reputable sources. And believe me, in my projects early on, and even now, if I can't find a part, I'll go to another source, not knowing where it is, and, buy Joe's parts and, .com, right? Whatever. Sorry if there's joesparts.com. I don't mean to imply that they're bad, right? But I'll go to some unknown website or, and buy something, right? So I think going to a reputable dealer, whether it be, DigiKey, Mauser, Arrow, something along that lines, that's going to reduce well over 99.9% of the problem. I think the other one is, in fact, I work a lot with a group in Los Angeles on this exact problem, where obsolescence of components is a huge issue now in any program. But whether it be AI or something else, right? Most components, or at least actives, aren't going to be around for more than 5 years. Maybe that's a little bit of a generalization, but so what they're looking at are quick microscopic investigations. So even just taking a big loop and looking at how does that printing on the active device look relative to others? Are there misprints on it? Believe it or not, we've seen made in USA misspelled quite sometimes, and some real doozies of issues. So that type of investigation, you could tell a lot with a visual look-see on things. But yeah, there's some incredible counterfeit problem stories out there where even some companies are building die, and it'll be about the same design of a normal active device that's well known and desirable to purchase, but that knockoff part would have different timing characteristics and such because they're using smaller dies and different geometries within the active device. So in that particular case, you really couldn't tell a lot by a visual inspection of the part. You're probably going to get burned badly.
You mentioned self-healing parts. What are self-healing parts?
Yes, it's kind of a new thing in the world of capacitors. We talked about them having a possibility, maybe a more than typical possibility of them failing, right? So if a capacitor fails, it's going to kill the circuit usually because of its configuration. Self-healing parts are actually families of components that when they've been driven into a failure, they may act in that failure state for a microsecond or much less than that. But due to certain characteristics that have been designed into the part, they suddenly heal themselves and they become capacitors again. That's really important. Now, they change after they self-heal, but they don't change appreciably. For instance, typically the capacitance will drop maybe 1 or 2%, and then the loss characteristics might change a little bit. They might become 0.5% more lossy, but usually that's of no significance because typically the devices are quite low loss anyway. So imagine this, right? You have an electric vehicle, and for some reason the snubber capacitors have failed. And now you've got maybe 40 kilowatts of maybe 60 or 80 kilowatts in the battery bank, right? That's a real problem if you got a dead short. So you'd have a heck of a fire. You'd have an explosion or something along that line where the part gets blown off the board, and you've got all sorts of problems. Well, these self-healing parts, actually, they'd see that failure. They would change their state and then work as a virtually new device until the next failure state occurs. Well, you can only get away with that maybe a few thousand times, but imagine having a part that doesn't go dead short, that could self-heal itself, and that's of huge importance. There's other applications besides electric vehicles. There's things like very high-end AI servers or quantum computing. I'm really hot on that, but you might have a $2 or $3 million cryostat type of investment, and you just can't afford to lose that investment because of a failed single component, or even a satellite. Same deal, right? You could self-heal in those types of configurations or applications. So it's really neat to hear about kind of like this magical thing where things will suddenly get better, never before seen, and it's coming, and it's already in use in many applications.
Now, in an electric vehicle, is there some way of identifying that part failed and healed itself? Is there a way to go into a log and say, it looks like we've got a problem in this area?
Yes, that's actually very true. It is possible. There are certain efforts underway that are probably patentable, but it's a very good thing to pursue. And the answer is yes.
Good. Okay. If you've got a failure that could be identified across a wide range of vehicles. I know, for example, the Tesla cars are talking back to the hive mind anyway, that they should be able to pull together a bunch of stats that are telling them that they've got a component failure or even a board failure or subsystem failure that seems to be happening that they can identify and correct either in the service or in the manufacturing.
That's right. Buses and trains as well. Safety-related circuitry, absolutely. This is a big deal, and it's going to be a net benefit for systems and end users.
Back to amateur radio, you said that you're moving from one house to another. Are you moving into an HOA?
Well, I guess there is an HOA there, but there's a great ham radio club at that location. So there's no limitations. I've got a vertical up, thanks to my brother, KD7JR, who set the vertical up for me on a recent visit. And I'm going to be putting up an end-fed ZAP. So, yeah, we're lucky with no limitations there.
And the ham radio shack that you're building there will be able to accommodate your wide variety of rigs.
Yeah.
And you're mostly doing CW. You're not doing any digital modes or anything like that?
I'm going to be getting into that, but I'm afraid I'm slow and I'm going to need some time. So maybe that'll be once I retire, which is probably relatively soon anyway. Yeah.
Retirement is not what I thought it was going to be. It's certainly different. I've actually been playing with the QRP Labs QDX, and just for people that say, well, what's Eric doing right now? I've discovered FT8 with this, and I've discovered FT8 with PSK Reporter that I'm quite surprised in terms of seeing whether the antenna that I have on the roof is actually capable of being somewhat omnidirectional and what it can hear. I'm quite surprised just listening to FT8 and then having it report back to PSK Reporter that my antenna hears all over the world. I'm surprised that, except for Antarctica, I've gotten over 100 countries I'm listening to, or at least it's saying that I've heard that those countries have come through my receiver. So I'm just pointing out, if you wanted to check how antennas are working, that some of these digital modes just in the passive listening is actually quite interesting. I've also discovered probably 5 watts is not enough power to do FT8, in a large competitive environment. But just when you're playing with the 7300, you might want to play from the standpoint of seeing what you can hear and how omnidirectional your vertical is.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Well, the first goal is to get ourselves back up to some higher speeds on CW. And absolutely, I think that FT8 is going to be a lot of fun. So we've installed the software and things along that line. And it's just, unfortunately, a time constraint. That's the real.
Actually, I hear that when you're buying poor components, that the problem I've discovered with poor components is that it's the time you're losing trying to figure out what the problem is. The time is more expensive than the components if I had just gone with the better components.
That's actually where I'm coming from. And in fact, when I do some builds with my friend Ben, even if we have some older parts around the lab here, we tend to just go and frankly hit DigiKey up and there's more places to buy than DigiKey, but you're right. It's the real problem. There's just no time. Hey, one other thing is that I'm starting to work is on noise configuration and noise characterization of passives. So it's really interesting that some of the manufacturers will have different metallization systems and different interfaces between those metallization systems and the multiple metals that might be used, and what an impact on parts. So you mentioned FT8. There's some other things going on in the world even quantum computing, right, where we have such incredibly small signals. But that's probably one of the reasons that kind of still not getting on FT8, worrying about that too much at work. It's amazing though how much you could improve with very minor changes in manufacturing methods or modest changes in metallization schemes. So there's going to be one more thing to worry about besides inherent reliability, things like noise or aging, things along that line.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. You mentioned that you have a parallel interest in arcade games, like pinball machines. How did that interest get started? I understand that there was a benefit that came out of the early interest in arcade games. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes. That really started with my wife and I, who at the time was in college with me. We were a couple of years apart. We ended up going and playing Black Knight pinball. And, it was a really inexpensive date back in the 80s where for $5 you could, get some food and something to drink and play a little bit. So that was fun. We ended up getting married and we bought a pinball game. Actually, I got a great deal on that pinball game. It didn't work. What happened was it took a very large surge. The MOV blew out and that MOV saved the rest of the board. So I just had some, minor rebuilds there. But that's how the actual pinball started. Through the years, I've owned some other really great ones, some Bobby Orr's, some other Evel Knievel type pinballs. After COVID, the price went crazy on these things. So I think I'm out of buying, never say never, right? But if I can find a deal, I'll get some more. But the prices went crazy.
Why do you think that is? Do you think more people became hobbyists during COVID?
I do. Actually, I work with another gentleman who's much more into it than me. He has, I believe, 30 pinball games, and he lives in the D.C. area. But what he found was that the man cave and the home entertainment just took off crazy after COVID. So now, pinball games that we were getting for maybe $300 to $500, maybe $1,200 on the absolute high side. I mean, they're $5,000 to $6,000 now. it's great, but it's limiting for someone trying to get in the hobby. From a video game point of view, video games themselves started after pinball, where I picked up a broken machine on the side of the road. It looked absolutely gorgeous, to the point where I had to stop at the people's house and, ask, is this really garbage? And they said, yes, the display doesn't work. And they're tired of fixing it. They said every time somebody came to fix it, it was $250, and, their kid moved and it's out of here. Right. So took it home, and very quickly it was the horizontal output transistor and a capacitor. Exactly what you said. The electrolytic dried out, shorted the transistor. And anyway, with maybe about an hour worth of rebuild, that thing is up and running. So I've got those, and then that just broadened out into other games, the Multicades and the Galagas. And the best video game story I ever have is I bought a broken one. I didn't know what I was buying. It was a cocktail version. Frankly, I was buying it for the case more than anything else, because those cases are hard to produce individually, but you could buy an older one and clean it up quite nicely, and it works out well with any game.
What do you mean by cocktail version?
Okay, there's an upright game, and there's the one that you sit down at, and this cocktail one was like a cocktail table where you could put two chairs on the end of it. But, I bought the thing for, I think it was $40, might have been 30 or 40, maybe either one. It was cheap, right? And I heard some jiggling around inside, and I was thinking, oh boy, what's the problem, right? And man, I had to drill out the game there was no keys. Everything was just in horrible shambles. So at any rate, I ended up opening up the game, and I found that there were notes in the cash box of, don't forget to do this or that. But there's also a few, physical currency notes in there. And then there was quite a bit of quarters in there. And I thought, wow, that's great. Kind of looked through the quarters, because some looked odd, and there was a few silver quarters. So actually I got paid by picking up that video game, and it's in the garage getting ready to be rebuilt. The monitor is bad, most likely horizontal output transistor and the capacitor there.
How do you find the time or make the time to pursue these projects in addition to your family obligations and your work and golf?
Well, I gave up golf, so I've played maybe a few times in the last year. That's it. But it's just, there's a lot going on. So luckily, my wife is an engineer as well, so she accepts a lot of the things that I do as hobbies, and kind of gets into them to some extent herself. Right? In fact, she was a ham. She let her license lapse, and expire. But that, it's funny. We both have hobbies, and they're kind of diverging, but we managed to fit them in. So
do you schedule the time on a calendar, or you just say, after dinner, I'm taking my coffee into the garage?
Yeah, that's kind of it, right? It's just, if there's some free time on the weekend or whatever, I'll just kind of randomly head on off there, and it works out.
Is there a dream radio project that you've always wanted to do that you haven't done?
Well, I always wanted to rebuild an S-line. So I don't think I'll do that because of the physical size limitations that I have, the new shack. So, well, that's probably the biggest rebuild hope. I've always wanted to do something and like MFJ did, or Heathkit, right? And kind of rejuvenate Heathkit. I think it would be possible. I think the problem, I'm biased, right? Because I grew up building Heathkits. So I love the thought of Heathkits. I just don't know if there's a business there. But yeah, if there was an absolute dream, I would love to kind of create a Heathkit type of entity that would have kits for people, because it's amazing what a kit could do. Or as you've seen, just the number of different Elmers I've had, in addition to my brother and Danya, there's, quite a few other guys that have really helped me steer myself into a career, all based on a hobby. And it's been a good run. So I just would like to try to do something like that. I just don't know if there's a need for kits, simple leaded kits that people could put together.
Do you want the brand Heathkit and the look and feel of the old company? or is it just you'd just like to have a kit company?
Yeah, I think a kit company, but the same theme, right? Where we would have the hope of attracting young kids or middle age or late age hobbyists and give them a good value and provide a device that's needed. And in a way, who would care about the profit? I wouldn't want to lose on the thing, right? But I think there's a net positive that could be gained for anyone that would build those kits and imagine the number of lives you could perhaps steal or steer into a STEM type role, because hey, STEM is really hot. Not to discount the importance of any other career, but STEM makes a lot of sense, and it's really quite lucrative, I think.
It could be QRP Labs. It could be any of the other companies that make, say, SDR receivers or something like that. I think that a kit company for kids would also have to have some integration with their smartphone.
Yeah.
I'm thinking off the top of my head, if you had a whisper receiver, for example, you're not a ham yet, but you have a whisper receiver and a way to build it so then you can plug it into one of the websites where you could actually, what am I listening to? And then maybe that would lead to experimenting with antennas. What's the best antenna I could connect to this receiver so I could see who's hearing me around the world on my smartphone? Any entrepreneurs out there that have an idea? But maybe those kits already exist, and the problem is the marketing or where do you find the audience with enough attention span to hear the message and take it through? Or maybe it's a science teacher in a junior high school that has to be the one that introduces it. You have to get the audience in the room first.
That's right. Well, we had thought, in fact, I mentioned this to a guy who was helping me do some remodeling at the potential of the new house that we're moving to. And his comment, it was the same thing, right? Because I kept thinking, boy, everybody's got a cell phone, right? Could there be something we could tack onto a cell phone to get a kid interested? And he said, well, I don't know about kids, but I want a nice, simple solar charge for my phone and for some other things that he was using. And, then we started thinking about, well, maybe it's a simple power source, something along that lines. I don't know, but that might be, in the future, just hard to say. But I think that would be an awful lot of fun after working years who knows? If I come up with an idea, I can do it during working years.
What is your sense about where the hobby's going in the next 10 years? Are you positive in terms of what's happening now, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm pretty optimistic. I think that it's interesting because even people that I work with, some of the middle-aged people are finding that they're now interested in radio. And that's good. It's interesting why they're saying they have this desire. One is just the possibility of speaking to different people around the world. I was amazed to hear that being maybe the number one reason. I was thinking, well, maybe it's going to be they're living in the Carolinas, right? No shortage of hurricanes and wildfires and floods and all of that, right? They actually didn't talk about emergency services. And from a young kid point of view, I think that's starting to come back. And the reason is, number one, I think that the ARRL does some great work in getting young people interested again, but also there may be cell phone overload. And the fact that a kid might want to go something, more simpler, and that might be neat. In fact, I was thinking about something as simple as the old MFJ monobanders and maybe redesigning one of those with a digital display and some power functions, right? Some integrated batteries, things along that lines. Something that could get a youngster kind of interested, something that's affordable and simple enough to build with some performance.
I happen to be a great optimist in terms of what's happening in amateur radio, because I think that the internet has just made it possible for us, ability to share information or just to find anything at this point now. So I'm thinking I can find this information, I can go and see if this is going to work, or I can try it and I can share it. Because of the internet is like instant gratification, or at least I can find just about anything. I think that's why I'm so hyped up on amateur radio now, is because 30 years ago, it would take a whole year for this process to present an idea, get feedback, and then rewrite the article. Now we can do it overnight. And I think because of that, we're kind of on this upward slope of information sharing, like we're doing now. Every day there's something new in amateur radio.
That's right. I think that's absolutely true. And the web has made things so accessible, as you say. The next step, I think, is going to be AI. Now, I think AI is going to help ham radio in another way because we'll want to get more of that personal one-on-one type of interaction. In fact, many times on Straight Key Night, I'll be talking to my buddy Mauro in Italy. And it's one of those things that, we always catch up and do the yearly catch up or maybe monthly catch ups. It's really wonderful. AI is going to change so much. And I think you're going to have just an acceleration of the hobby because of that. It's quite funny to think of a whole trend like that helping ham radio out, but I believe it's going to be there.
Just to be able to do what we do so well, and that is to transmit a signal into a piece of wire and talk around the world without $1 trillion worth of infrastructure holding it all up.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Hey, and the way, the random aspect of it, usually every ham that I've always met has just been so interesting, wonderful to talk to. It's just, I believe, going to increase in popularity.
Do you have advice that you'd give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
I think, number one, I felt guilty that I was out so much or for a few years. But the problem there is you got to pay the bills, right? So I'd say, number one, don't feel guilty and then jump back in full speed. I went back to CW just because I find it helps my memory. I actually think it helps my coordination and dexterity. So that's a big deal for me. The other thing is, experiment for the new modes and hit Hamfest, because I think the free flow of information, just like you're talking about on the web, but these Hamfests, you could pick up so much information and advice and good deals. You kind of don't know what you're going to walk. Well, at least I don't know what I'm going to walk out with at any Hamfest, but I'm going to walk out with a fair amount of stuff. And what a great way to get, an expansion of your hobby right there.
Did you go to Dayton this year?
Yeah, I did for my brother, right? So we hadn't gone in like 40 some odd years. We went and had a great time. He flew out from Phoenix, North Carolina, and we drove on up. And we were thinking that we're going to take a little convertible that I had, and thank goodness we didn't, because I had a mid-sized SUV just packed. So it was a successful trip.
Packed to go there to sell, or
packed to come home. So, hey, luckily, though, I got back here. My wife was not upset at all. And she thought some of the new purchases were outstanding, and they really were. But, yeah, so I think Dayton's just, a wonderful event. I guess I'm already hoping to go back next year. And, heck, I bought everything down to light fixtures for the house that were getting rusted by the sea there. So I found the deal of the century that paid off for my gas up there. I think I bought 30 some odd light fixtures for, I think, $1 a piece. And normally they're about $25. So, great success. Yeah.
What do you think is the most interesting purchase that you made at Dayton this year?
It's funny. My brother and I had talked to John saying, okay, I want to find an old Radio Shack 10-meter transceiver. And, that was my hope. I could find one. And he was optimistic that we'll find it. And I wanted to think I would, but, come the last day of our Hamfest, or the latter part of the day, lo and behold, we found a brand new one in the box for $90. So that was just huge for me. I really enjoyed picking that up, and I'll be putting that probably on a boat, to be honest. It's going to be a blast.
Was this a single sideband transceiver?
Right.
But it was amateur radio. Would it also do CW?
No, it didn't. But that's fine.
It was a converted 11-meter.
It's right. That's right. So, right. That's it. And I mean, it's great, nice, compact. It's going to be super. I'll enjoy that. Then I picked up a Geochron, and that was a blast having that thing set up. And I'm already a premium subscriber.
The mechanical Geochron, or?
No. Yeah, the Atlas 2, right. So the new, yeah, I didn't see any. I always wanted a mechanical one, but boy, I'll tell you that, the odds of me finding one of those, I think, is pretty low. And then, of course, the 7300, that was great to pick it back up. In fact, it was the second one I bought, and they're just tremendous. They're really great little rigs.
Sadly, I agree with you. One last thing on that. I'm just curious. The kids that are building these CubeSats, are they also using satellite-rated components for these CubeSats, or the life and duration of the CubeSat life with the automobile components be the right thing?
Yes. Well, that's a good question in the sense that they're all over the place. So, in fact, I really enjoy working with some of these young college kids, and Caltech's got a great program. There's a whole variety of colleges. In fact, I mentioned to them that there are certain grades of capacitors and other components that if they have a failure, they'll self-heal. So why don't they consider some of those devices? So I'll have to admit, when I first started interacting with them, they were using consumer grade parts and they were getting very poor mission duration success. They've now gone up to the automobile grade parts, and also sometimes they're going with self-healing components as well, which I think that's going to be the next big trend within passives, as well as embedded passives inside the active device packaging. But it's interesting. One of these guys, in fact, he's actually pursuing a kind of a path a little bit like I took with like the component aspect of integrating devices now. So he's, I believe, now signing on with with IBM. But anyway, I think that the young guys are coming around to a little bit more conservative design on LEO sats, and they're getting the good success.
I was thinking that perhaps these CubeSats have a limited life in their orbiting. Do you have a sense of what the lifespan is of a CubeSat?
I don't. I could say, though, that there is a great database that NASA has in terms of the cause of failure and the lifetime duration. I think Aerospace Corp also has that as well. The neat thing is, though, that we're now exceeding the typical duration just dramatically. I mean, orders of magnitude. That's you're finishing up missions, and that's a big deal.
Ron, I've had a wonderful time speaking to you. I know that every guest sends me back their message about how they're new at this, they haven't done this very much, they may not be interesting, and I always send them back a message that says, of course it'll be interesting. And of course, this was interesting, and I really appreciate your coming on the QSO Today podcast. With that, I want to wish you 73, and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Eric. 73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Ron. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in WA2TBQ in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who, as the consummate artist, makes this host and his guests always sound brilliant. Ben also publishes a weekly Jewish history podcast. There is a link to that on the QSO Today homepage. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.